September 29, 1939, marked the first full day following the formal signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty, which had finalized the partition of Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The treaty's immediate consequences were felt not only in Poland, which now lay under the dual occupation of two totalitarian regimes, but also across Europe and beyond, as nations began to reckon with the stark realities of the new geopolitical order. As the dust settled from the swift and brutal conquest of Poland, the emerging dynamics between the Axis powers and the Soviet Union began to take shape, raising critical questions about the future of the conflict and the strategies that would be employed by all sides. Poland under occupation, a divided nation's new reality. With the signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty, Poland's status as an independent nation was effectively erased from the map of Europe. The immediate aftermath of the partition saw the rapid implementation of occupation policies by both German and Soviet authorities, each intent on securing their respective zones and imposing their ideological and administrative control. In the German-occupied zone, the Nazis wasted no time in consolidating their control. The newly established general government, a colonial-type administration, was tasked with overseeing the occupied Polish territories not annexed directly into the Third Reich. Hans Frank, appointed Governor-General, began implementing Nazi policies with brutal efficiency. German authorities swiftly moved to dismantle Polish political, social, and cultural institutions, replacing them with mechanisms of Nazi governance designed to suppress any form of Polish resistance and to exploit the region's resources for the war effort. One of the first orders of business was the targeting of Poland's intellectual and political elite. The Gestapo and SS launched widespread arrests, detaining academics, politicians, clergy, and anyone deemed capable of leading resistance against the occupiers. These figures were often summarily executed or deported to concentration camps. Simultaneously, the Jewish population of Poland was subjected to immediate persecution. Ghettos were established in cities like Warsaw and Lodz, where Jews were forcibly relocated, stripped of their rights, and subjected to deplorable living conditions, foreshadowing the Holocaust's horrors. In the Soviet-occupied zone, the Red Army, supported by the NKVD, continued its own campaign of repression and integration. The Soviets quickly set about dismantling Polish administrative structures and replacing them with Soviet-style governance. Local governments were dissolved, Soviet officials were installed, and the collectivization of agriculture began in earnest. The NKVD expanded its operations, arresting anyone suspected of anti-Soviet sentiments or ties to the former Polish state. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, landowners, and intellectuals were deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. The Soviet occupation aimed to impose communist ideology on the newly acquired territories. Schools were restructured to teach Soviet propaganda, and efforts were made to suppress Polish culture and religion, both seen as obstacles to the creation of a compliant Soviet citizenry. The forced removal of populations, including mass deportations of Poles to Siberia and Central Asia, aimed to reduce the potential for nationalist resistance and to repopulate the region with individuals more likely to support Soviet rule. Diplomatic maneuvering and strategic reassessments. The formalization of the German-Soviet partition of Poland prompted a flurry of diplomatic activity as countries across Europe and the world grappled with the implications of this new alliance. The rapid conquest of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union had dramatically altered the balance of power in Europe, and nations scrambled to reassess their strategies in light of the emerging threat. In the United Kingdom, the British government was under immense pressure to respond to the increasingly aggressive actions of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had been discredited by the swift fall of Poland, and public and political opinion now demanded a more robust response to Axis aggression. On September 29th, the British War Cabinet met to discuss potential military strategies and to assess the readiness of the British armed forces for a broader conflict. There were calls for an immediate build-up of military forces, increased production of war materials, and a re-examination of Britain's alliances, particularly with France. The British also looked towards expanding their diplomatic efforts, seeking to solidify support among other nations, including the United States, which, while officially neutral, was increasingly seen as a potential ally in the fight against fascism. Discussions about securing the cooperation of smaller European countries and the British dominions also intensified, as Britain sought to build a coalition capable of standing up to the Axis powers. In France, the fall of Poland and the German-Soviet pact forced a re-evaluation of French defense strategies. The French military, heavily reliant on the Maginot Line and a static defense posture, faced a critical reassessment of its preparedness to confront a German offensive. French public opinion, much like in Britain, was becoming more critical of the government's lack of decisive action. On September 29th, discussions within the French high command and government circles centered on bolstering defenses, accelerating military production, and coordinating closely with the British to develop a unified Allied strategy. The United States and neutrality, a calculated distance. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the unfolding events in Europe with a mixture of concern and caution. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, while maintaining an official stance of neutrality, was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability and American security interests. The fall of Poland and the subsequent alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union raised alarms about the future direction of the war and the potential for wider conflict. On September 29th, discussions within the U.S. government focused on the implications of the German-Soviet treaty and the need to prepare for any potential threats to American interests. While public opinion remained largely isolationist, there was growing recognition among policymakers that the United States could not afford to remain entirely disengaged. The Roosevelt administration began to explore ways to provide support to the Allies without directly involving the U.S. in the conflict, leading to the expansion of policies such as cash and carry, which allowed belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. as long as they paid in cash and transported the goods themselves. The U.S. also intensified its diplomatic efforts, reaching out to other neutral countries to discuss the evolving situation and explore the possibilities for collective security arrangements that could deter further Axis expansion. These efforts reflected a growing awareness that the conflict in Europe, while distant, had significant implications for American security and economic interests. Axis and Soviet reactions, strategic calculations, and future plans. Within the Axis and Soviet spheres, the signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty prompted further strategic planning and coordination. Both Hitler and Stalin saw the treaty as an opportunity to secure their respective positions and prepare for future moves. In Nazi Germany, the treaty was seen as a diplomatic victory that secured Germany's eastern flank, allowing Hitler to focus his attention on Western Europe. The immediate goal was to consolidate control over the newly acquired territories in Poland and to prepare for a potential conflict with France and Britain. On September 29th, German military planners continued to refine their strategies for a Western campaign, drawing lessons from the swift and decisive victory in Poland to develop tactics for future operations. The success of the Blitzkrieg in Poland, characterized by rapid movement, concentrated firepower, and the element of surprise, was seen as a model for future campaigns. German propaganda continued to emphasize the legitimacy of the invasion of Poland and the treaty with the Soviet Union, portraying them as necessary steps to secure Germany's borders and protect its people from external threats. The Nazi leadership also sought to maintain public morale by highlighting the successes of the Wehrmacht and the apparent diplomatic prowess of the Nazi regime in securing peace with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, Stalin viewed the treaty as a strategic coup that expanded Soviet territory and created a buffer zone against potential threats from the West. On September 29th, Soviet officials continued their efforts to integrate the newly acquired territories into the Soviet state, enforcing communist ideology and suppressing any signs of Polish nationalism or resistance. The NKVD intensified its campaign of arrests and deportations, targeting anyone deemed a threat to Soviet control. Stalin also began to consider the broader implications of the alliance with Nazi Germany. While the Non-Aggression Pact and subsequent treaty provided immediate strategic benefits, Stalin remained wary of Hitler's long-term intentions. Soviet military planners began to assess the potential for future conflict with Germany, even as they continued to cooperate with the Nazis in the short term. This dual strategy reflected Stalin's cautious approach, seeking to maximize Soviet gains while preparing for any eventual betrayal by their German allies. International reactions. The global community's response. The signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty and the formal partition of Poland prompted a range of reactions from the international community. For many countries, the events of September 29 underscored the fragility of the existing international order and the need to prepare for a more turbulent future. In Italy, Mussolini's regime viewed the treaty with cautious optimism. While Italy was allied with Nazi Germany, Mussolini was concerned about the implications of the German-Soviet alliance for Italy's own strategic position. The Italian government continued to advocate for a negotiated peace and sought to position Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. However, Mussolini also began to prepare for the possibility of a broader war, ordering increased military readiness and the expansion of Italy's armed forces. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 29, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the German-Soviet treaty with a mixture of condemnation and concern. Coverage emphasized the betrayal represented by the Soviet alignment with Nazi Germany and the potential implications for European security. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Poland and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media celebrated the signing of the treaty as a diplomatic victory that secured Germany's eastern flank and allowed for greater focus on future campaigns. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff praised the agreement with the Soviet Union as a pragmatic step to ensure peace and stability in Eastern Europe, while continuing to vilify Poland and its government as the true aggressors. In the Soviet Union, state media portrayed the signing of the treaty as a necessary measure to secure the Soviet Union's western borders and to protect ethnic minorities from Polish oppression. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized the narrative of the Red Army as liberators and framed the division of Poland as a corrective action to restore historical injustices. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 29, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked the continuation of a harsh new reality under dual occupation, with little hope for immediate liberation. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. September 29, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty and the continued consolidation of control over Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War.